My father's voice cut through the crowded hall like a blade. All she's ever done is disappoint me. The words weren't shouted, but they landed harder than any slap. People turned to look, their eyes burning into me, while he kept his hand proudly on the shoulder of a young Navy SEAL he called his true protégé. I stood there, frozen in the silence that followed, my cheeks on fire, every muscle begging me to fight back. Instead, I swallowed it whole, just like I'd done my entire life. My name is Alma Whitmore, and that moment, being publicly reduced to nothing by the man who raised me, wasn't the first cut. It was only the deepest scar in a lifetime of wounds he carved into me with his silence, his coldness, and his refusal to ever see me for who I am. The hall smelled faintly of fried haddock, sugared pastries, and the salt that clung to everyone's coats after a walk by the harbor. Ceiling fans creaked above rows of folding chairs, and the chatter of neighbors catching up filled the gaps between the clinking of coffee cups. It was the kind of gathering this town held every year, a reunion of veterans, families, and people who'd known each other's names for decades. I slipped inside with my chin lifted, steadying myself for what I already knew. Harold Whitmore, my father, would be there, 75 years old now, retired Marine colonel, still standing straight as if the weight of a uniform clung to him even in civilian clothes. The town saw him as a hero, a man whose word carried gravity. To me, he was a man whose silence could bruise harder than any fist. When he rose to speak, the room hushed. His voice, sharpened by years of command, didn't need volume to slice through the noise. For one fragile moment, I wondered if he might surprise me with a trace of welcome. Instead, his words landed like a hammer. All she's ever done is disappoint me. The laugh lines on familiar faces stiffened. A few people coughed. Others shifted in their seats, caught between discomfort and the reflex to defer to him. My skin burned, but I kept still, my expression fixed, my body refusing to flinch even as my chest tightened. Then his hand came down with pride on the shoulder of the man beside him, Remy Caldwell, clean-cut, broad-shouldered, his bearing instantly recognizable to anyone who knew military men. "This," my father boomed, "is what real service looks like. A true protégé, a Navy SEAL." There were nods, murmurs of approval. Respect shifted away from me and gathered around him, just as my father intended. But Remy's confidence faltered the second his eyes locked on mine. The color drained from his face. His jaw trembled. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough for the whole room to hear, he said one name. "Black Widow?" The words cracked the air. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause, broken only by the faint scrape of a fork against a plate. Whispers rippled outward like a current, and every head turned toward me, not with dismissal this time, but with confusion, curiosity, and something that looked startlingly like respect. The smell of black coffee and shoe polish clung to every corner of that house by the water. To the neighbors, it was just another New England home. But inside, it felt more like a barracks than a family's refuge. At 8 years old, I was already being drilled to stand at attention, heels locked, shoulders pinned back, forbidden to blink until my eyes burned. My bed was inspected every morning. The sheets had to be drum-tight, the pillow crease sharp. Anything less was failure. My father never hid his disappointment. He wanted a son, a namesake to carry his rank and legacy. Instead, he got me. "Wrong from the start," he once muttered under his breath. And though he never repeated it, I heard it in every silence that followed. My mother, soft-spoken and careful, found her own ways to fight for me. She slipped folded scraps of poetry into my lunch bag. Dickinson, Frost, verses small enough to carry, but large enough to breathe through. She told me that words could steady me when nothing else did, that strength wasn't only measured in push-ups or parade formations. At 17, I made a choice that shifted everything. One night, while the house was dark and still, I sat at the kitchen table under the glow of a single lamp. The paper trembled beneath my hand As I filled out the Naval Academy application, fear knotted in my stomach, but determination steadied my pen. By dawn, the envelope was sealed. Months later, when the thick acceptance letter arrived, I carried it to my father's study. I should have said Dad, but instead I stood at attention and addressed him like the officer he always wanted. Sir. His jaw tightened as he slit the envelope. He read the first line, folded the letter, and set it down without looking at me. So you're serious? He said flatly. We'll discuss later. Later never came. The Naval Academy was not built to welcome me. It was built to test if I could survive it. Every morning, the yard filled with breath and frost, cadets running until lungs seared. I learned quickly that volume didn't earn respect. Precision did. Schedules, plans, logistics delivered without error. When I commissioned, I wasn't sent to kick down doors. I was sent to chart them. As an intelligence officer attached to SEAL units, my job was to spin the threads of information into maps they could trust with their lives. At first, they looked at me with doubt. A woman behind the table? Paper pusher, liability. But then came the missions. Nights when radios cracked with static, when convoys stalled, when chaos begged to take over. I learned to hear the shifts others missed. The slight change in a voice under pressure. The hesitation before an ambush. My web caught what could go wrong before it snapped. One operation nearly unraveled. A bomb maker slipped patterns we thought we'd locked. I redrew the routes under a flickering light, adjusted the timing by seconds, and whispered the pivot into the radio. No shots fired, no blood spilled, yet a dangerous man was taken alive, and every one of ours came home. After that, they stopped questioning. A SEAL chief tapped his knuckles twice on my table before heading out, a ritual the younger men copied. 2 knocks, like tugging the thread of a web they trusted would hold. The nickname followed. Black Widow. It wasn't about body count. It was about weaving the unseen, about sensing the tremor in the silk before anyone else. And in a blistering desert, months later, when a young SEAL froze under fire, my voice cut through his headset, calm and exact. Shift right. 2 steps. Now move. He did, and lived. That SEAL was Remy Caldwell. He never forgot the voice that pulled him back from the edge. The news came in clipped sentences, as if illness itself could be reduced to an order. My mother was sick. I left base on emergency leave and drove the familiar road home, every mile pulling me back to a house where silence weighed heavier than words. Inside, nothing had changed. My father still rose before dawn, still brewed his coffee strong and black, still polished his boots as though preparing for an inspection. Even with my mother fading in the next room, he clung to ritual like it was oxygen. I sat with her, reading poems she loved, watching her smile weakly at lines she used to recite by heart. He never joined us. When she passed, the funeral became another drill in his hands. I watched him from the pulpit as I delivered her eulogy, speaking of her kindness, her gentle way of making space for people the world overlooked. He sat in the front row, shoulders squared, his hand working a small stapler over and over, fastening the corners of the program until it looked like armor. When it was his turn, he spoke only a few sentences, efficient, impersonal, like he was writing a report instead of burying a wife. Afterward, I tried to reach him. I mailed photographs of my unit, snapshots of me in uniform, letters describing the work I did. I thought maybe pride would break through where love had not. Each envelope returned unopened. Months later, a childhood friend pulled me aside. "He keeps one of your photos in his desk drawer," she whispered. I blinked, unable to answer. If he kept it, why send the rest back? The question gnawed at me, and for the first time, I wondered if his denial wasn't just contempt, but fear. Fear of a daughter who had stepped into a world he could neither command nor control. The present pressed back in, the air inside the hall humming with the weight of what had just been spoken. Remy Caldwell stood taller now, his voice no longer a whisper, but a steady declaration. "She's Black Widow," he said, turning to the crowd. He painted the memory of that night in the desert, the stalled convoy, The ambush lurking, the voice in his headset that cut through panic and pulled them out alive. Gasps, murmurs, and sharp intakes of breath moved through the room. Faces that had looked at me with dismissal now shifted, curiosity and awe replacing indifference. My father forced a chuckle. His voice clipped and cold. My daughter files paperwork. She wouldn't know a battlefield if it stood in front of her. I didn't rise to it. I just met his eyes and let silence do the work. A veteran in the back row stood slowly. His hand went to his chest, palm flat, and he looked at me with a gravity that bent the room. She understands more than you think. His words rippled outward, drawing others into their orbit. From the back, a boy tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered a little too loudly. "She's real?" The father's answer came low but carried anyway. "Looks that way." The hall shifted on that single exchange. A tide had turned, small at first, but rising fast enough that my father's grip on the room began to slip. The hall had gone from a reunion to a courtroom without a gavel. Every cough, every shifting chair sounded like testimony. My father stood tall in the center, his voice hard enough to slice the air. "She only knows paper. Real soldiers know the price of battle." A few heads nodded out of habit, but eyes darted uneasily. The weight of certainty that used to follow him now wavered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list a single mission. I just met his stare and said evenly, "Respect isn't inherited, it's earned." For a moment, the words seemed to hang there, fragile. Then Remy stepped forward, shoulders squared, his gaze locked on my father. He began recounting the Alcar operation, not in sweeping statements, but in details only those who lived it could recall. The false signal on the second channel, the truck that stalled 2 blocks too soon, the timing that had to be shifted by minutes, and the voice over the radio that redirected them before the ambush snapped shut. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Those who had doubted me now leaned forward, listening. My father tried to keep his jaw set, but a tremor betrayed him. He attempted a laugh, thin and forced, but the room did not laugh with him. For the first time in my life, Harold Whitmore looked uncertain. The silence cracked when a man in the back rose to his feet. Then another, one by one. People stood, not for my father, but for me. A veteran pressed his palm flat over his heart. A silver-haired woman's eyes glistened as she whispered, "She did what we never saw, but we owe her our respect." My father tried again, voice sharp but thinner than before. "I'm sure she's excellent with spreadsheets, but a battlefield—" He left the line hanging, expecting laughter to carry him. None came. The air thickened instead, heavy as judgment. Then, from near the front, a boy no older than 12 tugged at his father's sleeve. His voice carried clear as a bell. "Uncle Harold, maybe you don't know everything she is." The words landed like a blade. My father's face hardened, but the edges of his authority had already begun to fray. For decades he had towered in this hall, every eye turning toward him as if by command. Now the room shifted, the tide rolled, and the light angled elsewhere. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, diminished inside the same 4 walls where he had once seemed unshakable. The crowd no longer echoed his certainty. They had chosen their own, and in that choice, they left him standing alone. The hall had turned dense, air pressing against skin like weather before a storm. Dozens of familiar faces that had once bent easily toward my father now tilted toward me, and he saw it. His eyes darted over the crowd, old comrades, neighbors, men who had followed his lead for decades, and every gaze that met his slipped past him, settling on me instead. His jaw tightened, shoulders rigid, as if posture could hold back the tide. He cleared his throat, lips parting, but the sound that came out carried no authority. It fell flat, a stray note in a room that no longer answered to him. I didn't take the opening. I didn't list the missions, the risks, or the men who'd come home because of me. I stood still, back straight, voice calm but certain. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned, sometimes where no one can see. The words spread slow and deliberate, filling the silence like water seeping into dry ground. No one moved. Not a chair scraped, not a breath broke too loud. It was silence thick enough to ring in the ears, silence that pressed harder than any applause could. And then it happened. My father's shoulders dipped, just barely, but enough, for the first time in memory. Harold Whitmore lowered his head, not in ritual, not in command, but because the weight of the room forced it down. The town bore witness. The man they had revered for years seemed smaller, the crown of authority slipping without ceremony. He had lost his place, not on a battlefield abroad, but here, at home, in front of the very people who once saluted his every word. The next night, I drove back down the narrow road that curved along the harbor, headlights cutting through fog that smelled of salt and wet pine. The house stood as it always had, weathered shingles, dark windows, the porch light flickering like it resented the duty. Inside, the kitchen hadn't changed. The same wooden table sat in the middle, scarred by years of use. My eyes caught on the faint burn mark in the corner, a blemish from a pot I'd set down too hot when I was 14. He'd scolded me for an hour that day. Now the mark looked like a map we had both forgotten how to read. We sat across from each other, 2 mugs of coffee steaming between us. The silence stretched, thick but not hostile, more like the uneasy truce of 2 soldiers after the battle. His fingers stayed wrapped around the mug, knuckles pale with effort. "I didn't know," he said finally, voice low, like gravel dragged across stone. I kept my gaze steady. "I couldn't tell, and you never asked." The words hung there, heavy as lead. He flinched almost imperceptibly, as though they struck harder than I intended. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock over the stove ticked loud enough to feel like a hammer. We both let it. Sometimes silence is the only language left. I stood to pour another cup, needing motion to break the weight. As I reached for the sugar tin on the shelf, something thin and worn slipped out from behind the stack of old manuals. A photograph. My breath caught. It was me, years younger, in uniform, cap tilted slightly, salt crust still clinging to my boots. The edges were frayed, as if handled often, but hidden well. I turned, holding it between my fingers. His eyes darted to it, and then away, the tremor in his jaw betraying him. His hand twitched as though he might reach out, but he didn't. "Proud," he said, barely more than a whisper, the words stripped of all his usual armor. I set the photo gently on the table and met his eyes. "Do the knowing now." He looked at me for a long time, eyes searching for something he hadn't had the courage to face. His lips pressed tight, shoulders sagging, the facade of command slipping inch by inch. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't the healing of decades. But in that dim kitchen, with the burn mark still etched into the table and the steam curling between us, a door cracked open just wide enough for light to push through. Not enough to chase away the darkness, but enough to remind us both it could be done. A few days later, the rhythm of work pulled me back in. Briefings, schedules, the endless hum of responsibility that had always steadied me. My phone buzzed with a message from Remy. "You made it honest," just 4 words, but they settled like a stone in still water, sending ripples I knew I would feel for years. Word from the reunion traveled faster than gossip ever had. In diners and on porches, people retold it as if they had witnessed history. They called it the night Harold's line fell flat. Some spoke it with awe, others with quiet relief, but always with the certainty that something in the town had shifted. One gray afternoon, I walked the familiar path to the cemetery. The sky hung low, silvered with cloud, and the wind off the water cut sharp through my coat. Grass bent and whispered against the stones. I stopped at my mother's grave, the letters of her name softened by time and weather. "We're learning," I whispered, brushing a hand across the cold granite. Slow, but in the right direction. The sea wind carried the words back at me like an echo. I thought of my father's bowed head in the hall, the photograph hidden in his kitchen, The word proud, spoken as if it hurt to say. Revenge had never been the point. The point was truth standing tall, forcing others to see what they'd refused to. I closed my eyes and heard her voice again. Keep flying. Not away, just up. And so I did.